There's a lot of different types of lady slippers out there. On this table here, we have four major categories that we'll go over really quick. The first one is Phragmipedium. These come from Central and South America. They're very wet-growing orchids. They like a lot of water, and they like to be a little bit breezy. Some air movement really helps them. Cooler temperatures on a lot of those. You also have here Maudier. This is a type where it's green and white with a little bit of that wine color in it. They come like this, where they have the striping in it. Sometimes they're very, very dark. People like these dark ones a lot too. This is a very nice plant. It's got a mottled leaf down here. It's really pretty. They look really pretty when they're out of flower. Wonderful orchid, easy for beginners. Then there's the type that they make the complex out of. This has a thicker tissue. It's a longer lasting orchid. The flower season on this is very seasonal. It tends to be November to February in the northern hemisphere. And then last we have a sequential bloomer. This stuff tends to bloom in summer. This is a Lowii hybrid, but this will have more than one flower on it blooming at a time. There's multiflorals and sequentials are both types of flower orchids that multiflorals and sequentials are both types of slippers that will produce more than one flower with each blooming. Hey folks, it's Joe at Emerald City Orchids, and today I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about lady slippers. Lady slippers are an amazing group within the orchid family. They're kind of special and they're unique to themselves. There's a lot of things that make an orchid and make orchids unique. One of the things that makes lady slippers different within orchids is that most orchids will have 3 petals and 3 sepals. This orchid has the 3 petals in the front, and on the back of the flower you can see it's got 3 sepals. 1, 2, 3. But on lady slippers, you have the 3 petals in the front, and on the back of the flower, there's only 2 sepals, the one up top and the one below. That's one thing that makes lady slippers different than all the other types of orchids. Another thing is that orchids will oftentimes have what's called a pseudobulb, or they'll have a very thick, succulent root. These are manners for storing water. Lady slippers do not have either of those. Because of that, you need to water lady slippers more often, typically twice a week. Lady slippers also, because many of them come from mountainous regions, can take a wide temperature range and fairly wide light ranges. A lot of them have these variegated leaves. It's really, really pretty. But make sure that you're watering it a couple of times a week because the lady slippers do not have a very strong water storage mechanism. A lot of orchids are able to communicate distress through various signs. Wrinkling in the pseudobulbs, wrinkling on the leaves. They'll have a different color. But lady slippers don't communicate stress as well, so you have to pay a little bit closer attention to the leaves. The leaves, when they change color, you'll know. Sometimes if the color is turning too bright, the plant needs less light. The color is getting really dark, you need to put it in a brighter situation. But almost always, you're going to need to water it a couple of times a week. With lady slippers, they also can take a little bit different composition to their medium. If the medium starts to break down over time for most orchids, you have to repot it. But with some lady slippers, you can let them go a little bit longer. Also, some lady slippers grow in rocky environments, so they'll do better in rockier media. You can add dolomitic lime to some Phragmipediums and other mountainous orchids in their material to help keep the pH in the right zone. And lady slippers also don't do well mounted. If you're trying to mount a lady slipper, it's going to give you a lot of trouble. There's very few lady slippers that grow in trees. Most of them are actually terrestrials. Some of the ones with the long curlicues have been found in nature, in the trees, but they're still very rare within the lady slippers to find ones that grow epiphytically. So grow your lady slippers in a pot. The family is huge, and it has several different genera. Some of them, like Phragmipedium here, can get really, really, really large. And then we have this tiny, tiny little Paphiopedilum. This thing is a type they use a lot for making complex paphs. This is a mountainous variety. It has a solid leaf to it. Tiny little flower. This one's a little tricky to grow, but still a very rewarding plant. One of my favorite types of lady slipper is the Maudier Paphiopedilum. Now, Maudier used to be a very specific thing, but now it's kind of a concept. It is a flower with green and white, and the albiform will look like this with no other additional colors. You can see the white striping. But when it starts to get the extra layer of color, we call the vinicolor to it, it gets a little bit of this burgundy-ish on top. and a lot of times it'll have these little hairy spots on here. These are fake flies that lure flies into going inside the pouch, and then they can't get out easily. They have to go in through a fly ladder that takes them right past the pollen. And of course, they do it all over again later, and then the flower pollinates. The back of the flower is also the ovary. This will turn into a seed pod, and it'll get really fat, and when it breaks open, all the little baby seeds come out. Now, Marie is, again, it's more of a concept now than an actual specific thing. There's been so many hybrids and hybrids of those hybrids made that now we're reaching some really interesting areas of breeding. There are some people who are making them super dark. They like a really dark one. Other folks are making them with more balanced color, but with a big, fat, and round flower. Sometimes people are trying to make them without so many spots and a solid color to the flower. I really like this one personally. I think it's very nice. That dark in there is really pretty. Marias also have this variegated leaf. When the flower is not in and you have just a plant, it's pretty to look at. They come in a lot of colors with a lot of variation to them. This one's got a lighter leaf with very small speckling, darker speckling with light bits in between. It's a really fun way to grow these plants because it's really fun plant to grow because they have a nice leaf to them. With these slippers, every set of leaves should bloom. If you look carefully, you can trace and see the history of the plant. There's a stump in there. That's where the flower bloomed before. You can see where the flower is coming up out of the new leaf. And then behind it, there's another new leaf. And when this gets large and the leaf span is the same size as the leaves before it, it will be ready to bloom also. With a lot of the Paphiopedilum, the key to making them flower is to let the temperature drop on them. They do very, very well with temperature drops to help them know what season to bloom in. This type of slipper tends to bloom in winter, but here in the Pacific Northwest, we actually get cold enough summer nights that sometimes these will actually bloom in summer, especially if we have a lot of cloudy, cold days in a row. We've had these things bloom in June, but they do tend to bloom for us more in the winter months. With the lady slippers, you also need to fertilize. If you are growing your orchids using well water, they can take that calcium lime in the water better than other orchids. But if you're growing on a water that's clean, you should think about maybe having some calcium magnesium in that water too. If you have a little CalMag and that fertilizer with it, it will help bring the plant closer to its natural environment growing in rocks. A lot of these grow on rocky outcroppings up high in the hills in the tropics. So, CalMag fertilizer, which you wouldn't use on some types of orchids, can actually work very well on this. If you are on well water, though, do be careful not to put that CalMag. It's already in the water. Another group of lady slippers are the complex Paphiopedilum. There's a very few that they make these from. They have a thicker, waxy texture to the flower and last a little bit longer. They are more seasonally restrictive. They tend to bloom in our area between November and February. That is the season. If it's blooming outside of that season, something is wrong. With the other types, they can bloom outside of their season more often, but with this, we tend to notice that here at the nursery, they're very, very regular bloomers. They have a solid leaf. They can get quite cold. You can put a little bit more CalMag in the fertilizer. They do like that. They have the thicker tissue will mean that they last longer. There are big ones that can get quite large, and there's also the tiny ones that are very rewarding, even though they're small. What's very important with these is that you have to make sure they don't get too hot, and when they do get cold, they'll bloom better for you. So if you let them get down as cold as 55, like we do here in the nursery, you'll generally get some pretty good results. When we talk about lady slippers, a lot of times we talk about the flower in terms of whether it's a single bloomer, a sequential bloomer, or a multifloral. And the difference is that a single bloomer will typically just make one flower, and the flower will last a long time. A sequential bloomer will make a flower that maybe doesn't last as long, but when it's done blooming, it produces immediately another flower, and then another flower after that, and another one after that. So it is blooming sequentially and will make multiple flowers on one stem, which is not the same as a multifloral. Both of these are multiflorals, and a multifloral will have multiple flowers open at the same time. So all of the flowers will open, and then the stem will present all of the flowers, and when the flowers die, they all die at the same time. These tend to bloom in summer. We're making this video in winter, so we don't have too many of them to show you, but they include Lowii, Rothschildianum, Sanderianum, other popular ones like that. These are a really great orchid to grow, and they're used a lot in hybridization. With these, you again want to water a couple of times a week, and they can get a little bit cool, and some of them can actually tolerate some very warm temperatures as well, which makes them very forgiving if you live in an area with wide temperature swings. I like multiflorals a lot because they make a really stunning display, and the flowers do last quite a long time with multiple flowers showing. So it gives you a really good show for a small plant. Multiflorals do tend to have larger leaves than some of the other types of lady slippers, and they tend to be a solid green. The bigger they are, the bigger the stem tends to be, as a rule of thumb. You'll notice with a lot of these lady slippers that we put them in a pretty standard mix. This is a regular mix that we use of bark, perlite, and charcoal. But you can also use finer materials. Some people have done very well growing these in osmunda fiber, and with some lady slippers you can actually add some rocks to the mix to keep the pH a little bit closer to what they have in nature when they're growing on rocky outcroppings. Lady slippers can take a little bit more fertilizers than some epiphytic orchids, but even then, you don't want to fertilize them too much. Give them a little bit of fertilizer, but not with every watering. And if you do give them a heavy fertilizer, maybe come back after fertilizing and flush them out with clean water. Salts can build up inside the pot. If you're fertilizing heavily and it doesn't digest all that fertilizer, it stays in the pot, and chemically it breaks down into salts. And that can mess up the pH balance. So, after you're done fertilizing, if you're giving them a heavy fertilizer, finish it off with a little bit of clean water. Or fertilize with every other watering or less. When you do fertilize, if you're fertilizing at home, just use a little bit, a tiny little bit in the water once a month is probably enough to keep your slipper growing great. If your light, water, and temperature is in balance, you're going to have a good lady slipper. If you add fertilizer to that, your good lady slipper will become a great lady slipper. If your light, water, and temperature are not in balance and you're adding fertilizer, it's not going to take a struggling orchid to great. How do I know what's going on with my lady slipper? What's happening down here? Well, what happens is they make a set of leaves, and over time it starts to die off. So if you look at this plant, it's growing in a direction towards me. This is the oldest growth, and the leaves on the bottom are starting to turn yellow. When they get like this, you can just rip them off with a gentle tug. You see the stem inside of the leaves, that's where the flower was. And behind it, on the next set of leaves, that's where the next flower came in. Here we have the set of leaves that's making the current flower, and behind it, if you look very carefully, you'll see the baby starting to come in. Behind that, brand new set of leaves. So this plant will produce leaves and flowers faster than the old leaves and flowers die off. In other words, it should get bigger over time. However, all of your old leaves, once they're done blooming, the clock is ticking, they're going to start dying off. It should die off slower than the new leaves come in, with your plant getting bigger over time. If it's dying off faster than the new leaves are coming in, there's something wrong with your roots.